Cannibalism is by far one of the most taboo subjects in human history. However, for every mass of people that find the idea disgusting, one person finds it acceptable or even exciting. Today we're going to start taking a look at the Cannibalism Iceberg, an amazing creation made by user SpookyMolder69 on Reddit. Before we get started though, I should mention I made a few changes to it. For one thing, I omitted Ted Bundy because he just wasn't a cannibal unless I really messed up and completely missed that. Furthermore, I removed Soylent Green, mostly because I don't find it too interesting or relevant to the video. Finally, I combined King's Drops, Blood Jam, and Medicinal Cannibalism because they're all the same topic. I combined the Asmat People and Michael Rockefeller because they too are both directly related. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into the first part of the Cannibalism Iceberg. Tier 1 of the iceberg deals with many of the more well-known incidents of cannibalism, as well as some setup concepts for the rest of the iceberg. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not sure why this one is on the iceberg, since headhunting is something companies do to find candidates, but here goes. Headhunting is the process of trying to get an employee to leave his okay, I'll do it right. This entry on the iceberg refers to how indigenous tribes would often hunt other humans and preserve the head, often consuming the flesh in ceremonies after the fact. This was primarily due to religious beliefs, namely that the soul was primarily centralized in the head, and taking it would add that amount of soul in the community, increasing things such as fertility or health, while the cannibalism was intended to give the same effects to the consumer. Some primary examples of headhunting communities include Celtic groups and the Jiak people of Borneo. The first major incident of headhunting in recorded history is in 1 Samuel of the Bible, in which David beheads Goliath after knocking him out with a stone from his slingshot, and there's been evidence of headhunting across the world ever since. It is even thought that Michael Rockefeller, whose death will be explored later in the video, had his head removed during the ordeal of being eaten. In modern day, headhunting has been used as a means of spreading fear through a population, terrorist groups such as ISIS taking credit for beheadings in the countries of Syria and Iraq. One of the most infamous instances of cannibalism, especially in American history, the Donner Party was a group of American settlers traveling west to California who, after getting caught in the winter, had to resort to cannibalism to survive. The Donner, or Donner-Reed Party, consisting of 23 wagons and 87 settlers, left Springfield, Illinois on April 15th of 1846 with the intention of reaching Fort Laramie in Wyoming. And they were in luck, as they were using a guidebook called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by Lanford Hastings, that talked about a shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff, that would save them 300 miles and about a month of travel. The travel west went as many others did, with changes in hierarchy and infighting, culminating with a small group splitting off from the rest, unsure of the Hastings Cutoff. Taking the cutoff proved to be disastrous for the group, as no road existed and there was no water to be found, and, after 40 oxen were lost in a stampede and many had to abandon wagons, a pair of men went forward to get supplies from California. With tensions high, James Reed accidentally killed another member of the party, resulting in him being exiled and heading for Sutter's Fort without his family. After George Donner was injured, the Donner family had to settle at Alder Creek Meadows, at a spot now called Donner Lake, for the winter. The rest of the party continued forward with the goal of crossing the Sierra Nevada and meeting up with the pair who had gone off to get supplies, who had brought back a pair of Native Americans to help them. However, due to impassable conditions, not the least of which being in early winter, they had to turn back, rejoining the Donners. Throughout the winter, escape plans and rescue attempts were made repeatedly, the largest being dubbed the Forlorn Hope, when 15 members of the party, including one of the men, Stanton, who had made for California earlier, and the Native Americans, attempted to get off the mountain in snowshoes. However, as they ran out of supplies, they were forced to eat those that had already died. The Native Americans are also believed to have been killed for food at this time. Finally, after all of this, the 7 survivors made it to California, and 4 rescue parties headed back to save the stranded immigrants, 2 of which Reed participated in, all seeing the starving men, women, and children and the bodies they had been eating. At the time of being snowbound, there were 81 members of the party. Only about half survived the winter. Alfred Packer, also known as the Colorado Cannibal, was a prospector that confessed to committing cannibalism, becoming the only person to be convicted of the crime of cannibalism in America. Packer was born in Pennsylvania on November 21st of 1842, growing up to become a shoemaker until the Civil War, where he enlisted to Company F of the 16th U.S. Infantry in April of 1862, though he was later discharged due to his epilepsy. After trying to re-enlist in Iowa, he was discharged again for his epilepsy and moved west to pan for gold. However, after no success, he began working as a guide, and the first report of his actions comes from the now-defunct Office of Indian Affairs and its appointed Indian agent, Charles Adams, in letters to Washington, D.C. In November of 1873, Packer was contracted to lead a group of 21 men looking for gold to a place near Breckenridge, Colorado. However, after getting caught up in a snowstorm, the group was forced to take refuge at the Ute Chief Uray's camp. Not wanting to lose time that they could use to pan for gold, a group of 5 of the men left, but were found later, nearly dead from starvation and exposure. Between the time the prior group left and were found, another group of 6, with Packer among them, headed for Los Pinos Agency, the center of U.S. governmental authority for the Umcumgagray Ute tribe, located in the Ute Reservation in western Colorado. 66 days after leaving, Packer was the only person to reach the agency. Upon being questioned, he claimed that he had been separated from the rest of the men and survived on rabbits and rosebuds. However, suspicion arose when a number of the men's possessions, as well as a large sum of money, were found on his person. Further questioning caused him to sign a confession admitting to eating his companions, stating that 4 had died of exposure and he had killed a crazed Shannon Wilson Bell, the 5th member of the group, in self-defense. He was charged with murder. However, after being given the keys to his cell, he escaped and lived under a fake name for 9 years until being recaptured. When captured, he signed another confession admitting to eating the other members of the group, this time stating that after coming back from a trip to find supplies, he found Bell surrounded by the 4 other men and was charged with a hatchet when Bell realized his return. He was initially sentenced to hang. However, after a change in legislation upon Colorado receiving its statehood, he was instead sentenced to 40 years in prison. He began his sentence in 1886, however was paroled in 1901, and spent the final years of his life in Littleton, Colorado, being described by those that met him as a kind old man who would tell the children stories of the West. Then, on April 24th of 1907, Packer passed away and was buried in Littleton Cemetery. While Packer claimed that the men had died of the elements or were killed in self-defense, what truly happened remains a mystery. In 1989, the bodies of the 5 men were exhumed and examined by law professor James Starrs. The bones of the men showed marks consistent with murder and defleshing, lending credence to a second story. However, Starrs believes that Packer was the one to kill them. While his story remains a tragedy, he has been immortalized in many ways. A popular restaurant exists in Colorado, named for the Wilderness Guide, and in 1993, Trey Parker, one of the creators of South Park, the greatest cartoon of all time, released Cannibal the Musical, a story of Packer's deeds in which Parker played the Colorado cannibal. Hey look, they put me on the iceberg. Autosarcophagy, also known as auto or self-cannibalism, is the act of eating one's own body. This can be harmless, like biting fingernails or eating one's own placenta, something known as placentophagy. However, it can escalate to include flesh and even organs. The most harmless types of autosarcophagy stem from the eating disorder pica, which is defined as a desire to consume things with no nutritional value or that aren't intended to be consumed. However, the more extreme types of autosarcophagy are commonly linked to mental illnesses, such as one case of a woman cutting open her forearm to eat the flesh, arteries, and nerves, being diagnosed with depression due to abuse she suffered as a child. One famous case of autosarcophagy is that of Countess Bathory, which leads us into our next topic, Countess Bathory. Nicknamed the Blood Countess, Countess Elizabeth Bathory was convicted of the murder of 80 young girls in the early 1600s, though whether or not she actually did commit those murders will be discussed in a minute. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 to a distinguished Hungarian family, However, many of the members of it are reported to be very disturbed, and at a young age she was taught of Satanism and sadomasochism by one of her aunts. When she was 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another powerful Hungarian family. As a wedding gift from the Nadasdy family, the pair moved to Castle Castich, and following their marriage, Nadasdy built a torture chamber that Bathory supposedly used to abduct and torture up to 650 young girls. Her torture was quite brutal and included things like shoving needles under the girls' fingernails, smearing them with honey and covering them in ants and bees, and eating the girls' flesh and drinking their blood to remain young and beautiful, as well as forcing them to partake in it as well. Her husband also supposedly helped with them. However, upon his passing in the early 1600s, the murders became much more frequent. This went on for years, with the help from her nurse, Ilona Jew, and a local witch, Dorita Bzentes, as her family's influence and the social status of the girls kept the crimes under wraps. However, when she began taking noble girls, King Matthias intervened and began the investigation that got her caught. She and her accomplices were tried for 80 murders and convicted of all of them, Jew and Sentes being executed, while Bathory lived the rest of her life in solitary confinement until her death in August of 1614. However, more recently, many have found reasons to prove that she didn't do it, believing that she was instead framed due to the fact that she was seen as dangerous and a threat to the government's power structure. Bathory owned a printing press and also taught girls to read and write, giving people access to information they otherwise never would have learned. This would have ruined the government, and because of this, she needed to be completely discredited and demonized. She also inherited an immense fortune upon her husband's death, giving another reason for members of the government to imprison her. Bathory spent the modern equivalent of £26 million on clothes from Venice. This amount of clothes is more than one could ever need to comprise a wardrobe, and would instead be more fitting for starting a business, and it's speculated that Bathory smuggled the 650 girls she had supposedly killed out of a warring Hungary to a more peaceful area of Europe to work in one of her business ventures. According to Oxford Reference, Long Pig is supposedly a translation of an expression coming from a group of cannibals in the Pacific Rim. Other sources, such as Dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster, state that the definition of the phrase is simply human flesh as food or the victim of such a practice. Also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, notable for the scale and brutality of his murders, as well as the sensationalism of his case, both then and now. Dahmer was born on May 12th of 1960 to parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was described by those around him as a happy kid until he turned 6, when he suffered a double hernia and a subsequent surgery recovery process that was painful and traumatizing. Following these events, he became more introverted and withdrawn, avoiding people more than he used to. Shortly before he began kindergarten, his family moved to Ohio, where he was enrolled in Hazel Harvey Elementary School. Teachers reported him feeling neglected when his baby brother David was born. It was around this time that he developed a fascination with dead animals, commonly collecting the remains of roadkill and preserving the bones in formaldehyde. By 14, he began drinking, something that would become a lifelong vice, and by 16, he would often bring alcohol to class. During this time, he reported having fantasies involving corpses. However, it was his parents' constant fighting and subsequent divorce that is what caused him to move his fantasies closer to reality. After he graduated, he committed his first murder in 1978 against 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, where they both got drunk together, and not wanting Hicks to leave, Dahmer hit him in the head with a barbell before strangling him. He dismembered and buried Hicks, though he was later exhumed, and he scattered his remains across a wooded ravine. Following this, he went to Ohio State University, but dropped out after only 1 quarter and enlisted in the Army, getting stationed in Germany. Interestingly, 5 mutilations that are still unsolved took place during his stay there. In 1981, he was discharged from the Army due to his alcoholism and drug abuse, and moved to Miami. During his time in Florida, another unsolved murder, this time of a 6-year-old girl, took place. He then moved to Ohio, and after getting arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, he moved in with his grandmother in Wisconsin, and 5 years later was arrested again for handling himself in front of a pair of 12-year-old boys. For this, he was given 1 year probationary sentence. He committed his second murder 9 years after the first one against Stephen Twomey, though this one seems more like an accident than the others. Not to relieve him of any responsibility, I think it's just important to mention. He met Twomey at a gay bar, and, after getting drunk together and falling asleep, woke to find Twomey dead next to him without any memory of the previous night's events. Following this, he began to kill regularly, committing 2 more murders in his grandmother's house before she kicked him out in 1988, citing his habit of bringing home young men and the smell coming from the basement. Shortly after moving out of his grandmother's, he moved into an apartment and, the very next day, lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy to his apartment, promising him $50 for nude photographs. For this, he was arrested and charged with sexual exploitation and second-degree SA, while the trial was set for May of 1989. While awaiting trial, he moved in with his grandmother, and during this time, he killed Anthony Sears, keeping his head and genitalia. This is the first instance of his habit of keeping pieces of his murder victims. He was found guilty of the charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison, however he was paroled after only 10 months. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, stated years later in an interview that he had requested a psychological evaluation of Jeffrey before his parole, however there is no evidence that this evaluation ever took place. In the 2 years following the release, Dahmer committed 12 more murders, going into a spree many other serial killers go into shortly before their arrest. During this spree, he would perform experiments on his victims, often trepanating them and pouring things like muriatic acid or boiling water into the hole in order to create an entirely submissive partner that would never leave him. However, having no success with this, he would simply kill the people he performed these experiments on and keep pieces of them, cannibalizing many. On May 27th of 1991, a boy Dahmer lured into his apartment, who, tragically, was the brother of the boy Dahmer had been arrested for taking illicit pictures of, was able to escape and found the police, however was entirely incoherent due to how intoxicated he was. Dahmer talked to the police instead and explained to them that they were lovers and that the boy was intoxicated. And, after doing an extremely lazy search of the apartment, if they had looked even a little harder they would have found the body of another of Dahmer's victims, they left. Immediately following the police leaving, the boy was strangled. Dahmer was finally arrested on July 22nd of 1991, after another one of his victims, a man named Tracy Edwards, escaped with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. Finding the police, he told them that a man he had met had tried to drug and restrain him, and, after doing a more thorough search of the apartment, found Polaroid pictures of the bodies, as well as a large collection of parts, including bones, that Dahmer had said he intended to make a shrine out of. Dahmer's trial began in January of 1992, with his defense trying to get him an insanity plea. However, on February 15th of 1992, he was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to 15 life sentences. He supposedly adjusted well in prison. However, on November 28th of 1992, a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver beat Dahmer to death in prison, stating that Dahmer had been antagonizing him, as well as that, quote, God told him to do it, end quote. To end on a slightly happy note, following his death, a group of businessmen raised $400,000 to buy Dahmer's possessions and destroy them in order to distance the town from his depraved actions. The Aghori are a Hindu monastic order of sadhus, meaning that they are religious people who renounce worldly pleasures to pursue spiritual enlightenment. Despite this dedication to the religion, they are not very well respected due to their beliefs being considered contradictory to other Hindu paths to enlightenment and their practices being considered macabre and unorthodox. The sect began between the 7th and 8th centuries with Baba Keenaram, who was believed to be an incarnation of Lord Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, and supposedly lived to 170 years old. Upon his death, he was buried in Varanasi, India, considered to be a holy city by Hindus. This results in a pilgrimage to be made to the city each year by Hindus, including those of the Aghori sect. The Aghori often live as beggars, however some work as blue-collar laborers, and a few exist in the government. They have a headman, Mukia, at the top of their hierarchy, with a priest, Sardar Naya, and treasurer, Bandari, beneath him, and those who go against the council's rules are excommunicated. However, the reason we're talking about them is because of their ritualistic practices. The Aghori believe that spiritual enlightenment can be achieved by embracing practices that society deems taboo, resulting in them not seeing a difference between good and evil, as the distinction between the two is simply an illusion. They also believe that spiritual power comes from the dead. Because of these beliefs, they often eat human flesh from bodies they pull from the Ganges River, and rub ashes from crematoriums on them. Not only this, they are known to drink urine and eat feces in order to kill their ego and human perception of beauty. Despite this, they aren't the center of any major controversies, and seek only to transcend the limitations placed upon them by society. Michael Rockefeller was supposedly killed and cannibalized by 4 members of the Asmat people after his boat capsized and he swam to shore. However, to understand why it happened, we must first understand the Asmat tribe itself and the events leading up to Rockefeller's death. The Asmat are a Wood Age civilization that live on the west half of New Guinea in the least developed area of Indonesia. The Asmat have a population of about 65,000 divided among hundreds of villages. The size of these villages range drastically, the largest of them being comprised of 2,000 or more individuals. The first recorded contact with them came in 1623, when a Dutch trade ship saw them from the deck, however they didn't stop. The first meaningful contact with them came in the 50s, when Catholic missionaries and the Indonesian government began to colonize the area they lived in. The Asmat have very spiritual beliefs, venerating wood as sacred due to how life-sustaining it is, that no death is natural, and that spirits of the dead are able to influence the world of the living. Because of this, they perform many rituals to provide them with spiritual protection, as well as to appease the spirits of the dead. Their belief in no natural death meant that all who died was the result of black magic performed by a rival village, and as such, the village of the dead would go attack and headhunt many of another village. They believed that by killing and eating a man, they gained his power. However, after the Catholic missionaries arrived, they forced them to stop the headhunting and cannibalism practices, as well as the warring, and converted many of them to Catholicism. Today, the Asmat people are primarily Catholic. Michael Rockefeller was born on May 18th of 1938 to Margetta and Nelson Rockefeller, the latter of whom was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the famous oil tycoon, and later became vice president under Gerald Ford in 1974. Michael lived as normal of a childhood as anyone as immensely wealthy as the Rockefellers could, getting schooled in the arts by his father and graduating from Harvard in 1960 with a Bachelor of Science in History and Economics. In 1957, Nelson Rockefeller opened the Museum of Primitive Art, a museum intended to display pieces made by less developed peoples. Interesting Michael, he signed on to the production of a documentary on the Asmat people being made by a filmmaker he met at Harvard as a sound engineer. In the middle of May 1961, he went on a scouting trip to the area and returned again in October of the same year, this time with the government anthropologist Renee Wassing. With the assistance of 2 Asmat teenagers, they visited 13 villages over 3 weeks before stopping off at Agats, the capital of the Asmat district, to grab supplies for another month of time with the Asmats, this time in a much less quote-unquote cultured area. Rockefeller and Wassing intended to meet a priest who knew the area well, however the boat Rockefeller, Wassing, and the Asmat teenagers were using to cross the Betscha River capsized in turbulent waters. Having spent their entire lives on the river, the 2 teenagers swam to shore and ran to get help, leaving Rockefeller and Wassing stranded. Fearing that they would float out to open sea, on the 19th of November, Michael stripped down to his underwear, tied a pair of jerry cans to his belt, and began swimming for a shoreline, gauged to be between 3 and 10 miles away. This was the last time Michael Rockefeller was seen alive. The search for Rockefeller began as soon as Wassing reported what had happened to his rescuers. However, after over a week with no luck, his family who visited to search for him returned home on the 28th, and other search efforts were called off 2 weeks later. In December of 1961, missionary Hubertus von Page traveled to the large Asmat village of Omadesep, where two Ometisep and two Otsjanep, another Asmat village often at war with the Ometisep, told what many believe to be the story of Michael Rockefeller's death. After 50 Otsjanep men had taken building supplies to a government post and began the journey home, they were waiting for the river's tides to turn. During this pause in travel, they saw a white man in white shorts that had no pockets and were up higher than all other shorts. One of them brought up how they had always talked about headhunting white men, and after a short argument, an Otsjanep speared him as he was climbing into their canoe. The spearing wasn't fatal, however, and they took him up to the Jawar River, where they killed and ate him, before distributing his bones among the people there. Unfortunately, it can never really be known how Michael Rockefeller died. Many, including myself, believe the story of the Asmat people. However, the official story is that he drowned, and many others say he simply assimilated into the Asmat culture, citing images of Asmat people much paler than the rest. To poke a hole in this one, though, Asmat people with albinism do exist and are not entirely uncommon. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old female tourist who, in the middle of her stay at the infamous Hotel Cecil, mysteriously disappeared. Elisa Lam was born on April 30th, 1991, to parents David and Yina Lam, both immigrants from Hong Kong that co-owned a restaurant in Burnaby, British Columbia. At the time of her death, she was an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia, and in early 2013 went on a trip to California, checking into the Hotel Cecil on January 28th. The days leading up to her disappearance, she had a few instances of acting erratically. While staying at the hotel, she was with a few other young women. However, after scaring them with her behavior of locking herself in the room or leaving notes telling them to leave, she was given her own room. She was also escorted out of the taping of a show for, quote, bizarre behavior. And of course, there is the infamous elevator video taken the day she disappeared. In it, she can be seen running into the elevator looking terrified and occasionally peering out of it as if to check for someone following her. She was reported missing when she didn't call her parents on the night of the 31st, breaking the tradition that she had held for the rest of the time she was on the trip. Almost 3 weeks after being last seen, her body was discovered in a water tank at the top of the building after many guests reported the water being black and tasting funny. Quick question though, if these guests saw the water was black, why on earth did they drink it? When the elevator video was released, almost 2 weeks following its recording, and about a week before Elisa Lam's body was found, internet sleuths came up with many theories. The most prominent one is that she was seeing and being followed by something supernatural. The Hotel Cecil is a famous, supposedly haunted location, with a large number of deaths and ghost sightings happening at the hotel. Another popular one was that a guest or hotel employee with ill intentions was following her, and she was acting the way she did to hide from them. Furthermore, there were no other cameras in the hall on the floor Lam was staying on, so there wouldn't be any other evidence of a person following her. Of course, this brings up the questions of why didn't the attacker go into the elevator, as it is very likely they would have seen her, and there likely would have been another witness to this, so why didn't they report anything? Furthermore, when the body was discovered in the water tank at the top of the building, it was determined that it would have been very difficult to get her up the building and into the tank the way she was. The final theory, and the one I find to be most likely, is based on the fact that Lam was on bipolar medication, however hadn't taken it. This serves as a good explanation for her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Following the discovery of Lam's body, her parents filed a negligence suit against the hotel, as Elisa should have been prevented from accessing the roof without their knowledge due to an alarm intended to go off if someone opened the door to the roof. Unfortunately, they lost this case due to the fact that the roof was an area Lam wasn't permitted to be on. Also referred to as the Kentucky Cannibal, Boone Helm was a serial killer, gunslinger, and cannibal during westward expansion. Levi Boone Helm was born on January 28th of 1828 in Kentucky to a family described as honest and hardworking. At a young age, his family moved to Missouri, resulting in him living on the edge of American civilization and the quote-unquote Wild West. From a young age, he displayed traits of delinquency, acting violent and rowdy around his peers, and having a penchant for drinking. In his early 20s, he married Lucinda Frances Browning, and was known to frequently beat her, especially during his drunken state. Due to this, she divorced him a few years later, Helm's father paying for it. This cost his family all the money they had, and Helm, in an attempt to make the money back, planned to travel with his cousin to California, where the gold rush had just begun. This cousin is the first known murder he committed, as when the cousin tried to back out of going to California with him, Helm stabbed him in the chest, killing him. He was subsequently hunted down by a group of his cousin's friends, and, after getting convicted of the murder, was placed in an asylum. Unfortunately, after gaining the trust of the guards, he was able to escape and continue his journey to California. As was a pattern with him, he was very confrontational and dueled many, much to the ire of the other miners in the area who chased him out of California. The next time he is documented was in Dalles, Oregon, with a group of 6 others he had met along the way, all with the intention of reaching Fort Hall in Idaho before going south to Salt Lake City. During the group's trek, they were caught in the winter on the mountains of eastern Oregon, and, after getting chased deeper into the woods by Native Americans, were forced to kill their horses for food and warmer clothes. As they continued to Fort Hall, the men began dying due to starvation and exposure, the members that were still standing leaving them in the snow. Unable to continue going, the final member of Helm's party, a man named Burton, was left in an abandoned cabin near Fort Hall. However, when Helm ran out of food, he returned to the cabin. During one of Helm's outings to grab firewood, Helm returned to find that Burton had killed himself with a shot from his pistol. Not having anything else to eat, Helm cannibalized his dead companion before taking some more with him and continuing his journey to Fort Hall. He was found at a Native American camp by a man named John W. Powell, who took care of Helm by providing him food and clothing, though never received so much as a thanks from Helm. He eventually reached the Mormon settlement of Salt Lake City, killing many here. However, it was the murder of the unarmed Dutch Fred that forced him to leave. He was next found in British Columbia, having eaten and possibly killed his companion for the winter. He was tried for the murder of Fred, being held in Portland, Oregon. However, when no witnesses were present, he was let go. Following this, he supposedly traveled to Texas, where he killed more. In 1862, he killed 3 men for the $32,000 in gold they had on them, and was arrested in Montana when he went to try and retrieve it. In 1863, after being released from prison once again, he was arrested for a final time after joining Henry Plummer's gang, and on January 14th of 1864 was executed by hanging. Compared to the last few entries, this one is a bit more lighthearted. The story of Hansel and Gretel was written by the brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, famous for stories such as Rapunzel, Cinderella, and The Godfather, no relation. The story begins by telling us that the land is going through a famine, and that a woodcutter, his 2 children, and the children's stepmother are very poor and have little food. The stepmother says they should leave the children in the woods to die, and the father begrudgingly agrees. However, Hansel leaves a trail of pebbles behind that lead them back home. This happens again, only the stepmother locks the children in their room, preventing them from gathering pebbles the night before, and forcing the children to leave a trail of breadcrumbs. This is also where the phrase trail of breadcrumbs originates. Unfortunately, a crow eats the breadcrumbs, leaving them lost in the woods. The children explore the woods, searching for food before they come across a house made of bread, cake, and sugar, inhabited by a nice old woman with no bad intentions at all. She brings them inside and feeds them, only to reveal to Gretel that she intends to fatten Hansel up and eat him. At this point, the story tells us that witches have red eyes, don't see well, have a sense of smell like in animals, and can sense nearby humans. Over the next 4 weeks, she feeds Hansel while working Gretel, and after getting tricked over 4 weeks into believing Hansel is still thin, decides to eat him and Gretel anyways. However, Gretel tricks the witch into climbing into the oven, where she dies. The children then steal all the witch's riches, and leave for home. Also, they ride a duckling across a river, because that is a viable means of transportation. And after all these misadventures, they end up home to find their father, who never wanted to leave them, and that their evil stepmother had died. Honestly, I'm really glad the Iceberg maker put this here. It made me feel just a little bit better after everything else. Coming from the Cree word Wendigo, the Wendigo is a mythological creature originating from oral tradition in Algonquian-speaking and Native American languages, namely the Cree and the Anishinaabe. Though the modern interpretation of the creature is that of a 15-foot-tall skeletal creature with antlers, the original tales presented as much more ethereal, as a spirit that possesses those who partake in taboo actions such as cannibalism, cursing them with an insatiable desire to consume human flesh. Native folklore describes it as a personification of hunger and cold during the harsh winters of America, using the tale as a story warning against selfishness and greed. Interestingly, modern psychologists have noticed the culture-bound syndrome Wendigo psychosis among many First Nations people. As the name implies, Wendigo psychosis gives people the delusion of being possessed by an evil spirit, as well as the desire to consume human flesh. From a psychological standpoint, this is fascinating, as it truly shows how much the stories and culture we surround ourselves with are able to alter the very way we think. The Wendigo has also been a scapegoat for numerous crimes, a couple notable ones being those of Cree hunter Swift Runner, who was hanged after killing and eating his family, claiming that a Wendigo possessed him to do it, and Sandy Lake First Nation community shaman Jack Fiddler and his brother Joseph, who strangled Joseph's daughter-in-law to prevent her from becoming a Wendigo. Of course, there is also the modern interpretation of the Wendigo that has made many appearances in pop culture, examples being present in Pet Sematary by Stephen King and the Incredible Hulk and Wolverine comics from Marvel. To be honest, this one is probably my favorite entry on the iceberg. The phrase foot taco refers to a man who, after getting in a motorcycle crash and having the lower half of his leg amputated, took it home and ate it with a group of 12 friends. The original Reddit post was an AMA from a user, Incredibly Shiny Shart, titled, "Hi all, I'm a man who ate a portion of his own amputated leg, ask me anything," and provided images as proof. The poster claimed that he had a taste like beef, and that he was able to get his friends in on eating himself because of a long-running joke that if they were ethically able to commit cannibalism, they would. He even said the experience gave him some closure on his accident, and that since then, his life has improved in many ways. Honestly, as someone who spends a lot of time going around the terrible parts of the internet, this story is really encouraging, and I wish this guy the best. For all those asking how this is possible, there is no law in the US against cannibalism except in Idaho, and it's simply a taboo subject to most, and this really does illustrate that. This entry on the iceberg refers to a letter containing half a kidney received in October of 1888 by a man named George Lusk, who was the president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, from who was supposedly the infamous unknown killer, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is known to have killed at least 5 women, and theories on his identity range from surgeon to cop due to the way he dismembered and hid bodies. However, during his killing spree, which was between August and November of 1888, someone claiming to be him maintained a written correspondence with the police. In these letters, he would often threaten to send a piece of body part of one of his victims, such as threatening to send a piece of an ear in a letter dubbed the Dear Boss letter, while the received letters only contained drawings of supposed victims, with crude lines denoting where he had cut them up to that point. The infamous From Hell letter included half a kidney, as well as claims of cannibalism. Something interesting to note is that the letter contains spelling errors that were not seen in the previous ones, raising suspicion that this letter could have come from a different person. Upon receiving the letter, Lusk assumed that it was a joke, and that the half-kidney came from a sheep. However, the pathological curator of the London hospital stated that it was human, likely Catherine Eddowes, a victim of Jack the Ripper. However, this opinion would come under scrutiny, and there was debate over whether or not it truly was a human kidney. Unfortunately, little can be concluded, as the murders took place over a century ago, and most of the evidence against any given suspect was destroyed in the Blitz of London during World War II. Possibly the saddest entry on the iceberg, and certainly on the first tier, the Miracle of the Andes refers to the plane crash in the Andes Mountains and the subsequent 72 hellish days that the survivors had to endure stuck on the mountain before help arrived. On October 12th of 1972, the Old Christian rugby team left their home in Uruguay for the Montevideo airport, headed for an exhibition in Chile, however had to touch down in Mendoza, Argentina, due to bad weather. Despite the ridiculing from the upset team, the pilots held off from leaving the airport as long as possible due to the still poor weather. However, due to the plane they were using being on loan from the Uruguay Air Force and unable to stay in foreign soil for more than 24 hours, they were forced to leave at 2 p.m. on Friday, October 13th, with 45 people on board the plane. The superstition associated with the date was not lost on the team, who were reportedly making jokes about the date of Friday the 13th. The warm air of the afternoon created instability in the atmosphere, something that ended up contributing to the crash. The plane was also unable to fly directly over the Andes Mountains, as its maximum cruising altitude was about 100 meters below the height of the mountain's peak. Because of this, they were forced to take a U-shaped path around it, moving south toward lower areas of the mountains and back north toward their final destination of Santiago. However, the co-pilot misjudged the position of the plane about an hour into the 90-minute flight, turning north early and beginning to descend. Noticing that they were much too close to the mountain, they did what they could to fly upward, however were unable to, and the belly of the plane hit a ridge, causing the wings and tail to break away. 7 members were sucked out of the plane before they crashed, and upon impact another 4 died, while over the next 2 days, 5 more perished. On the 4th day, a plane passed over the crash site, however it did not see them. The surviving group was able to create a steady source of water by melting snow and aluminum obtained from the plane's seats. However, food quickly became a pressing issue. The plane was only packed with light snacks customary to a passenger flight, and Nando Parrado, one of the most outspoken survivors who wrote the book Miracle of the Andes detailing his experiences, reported eating a single chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days, and discussion quickly moved to eating the bodies of those who had died. Of course, many sought to avoid this for as long as possible, eating things like leather from luggage. However, after hearing search efforts had been called off through a transistor radio, all eventually partook. On the 18th day of being stranded, an avalanche hit their campsite, killing 8 more and trapping the rest inside the fuselage of the plane for 4 days. Believing that they were only 5 kilometers from Chile, 2 of the survivors, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, left to get help on the 61st day, climbing twice the amount recommended at that height in a day in 1 morning. However, upon reaching the summit of the mountain, 15,000 feet above where they started, they realized they were actually about 80 kilometers away. Knowing they couldn't return empty-handed, they continued west and trekked 37 miles in only 10 days, coming to a river containing signs of life such as camping materials and cow manure, before encountering a man on horseback on December 20th. Unable to be heard over the noise of the river, the man on horseback and 2 companions who joined him communicated with the pair of survivors through notes tied to rocks. On the morning of the 22nd, they were taken to a nearby hut and fed, explaining that they had survived the plane crash and that there were others still at the crash site. Needing a guide, Parrado joined the rescue team on the helicopter, later recounting that when they were above where they had crashed, he was unable to spot the camp and feared that they would have to leave the rest of the group to die. Luckily, Parrado found the crash site, and 6 of the most critically injured were taken on the 2 helicopters, while those in better condition stayed another night with a rescue crew. Despite the horrific nature of what the group had to live through, many were quick to criticize them, going as far as to state that they had invented the avalanche as a means of excusing the cannibalism. However, neither the Catholic Church that the group was a part of, nor they themselves had any issue with it, and all of them signed up to be organ donors upon their deaths. The Miracle of the Andes was a terrible tragedy that never needed to happen, however it did bring some very uplifting stories of triumph of will out of it. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure why Ed Gein is on here, because he never committed cannibalism, however he did inspire Leatherface, so we'll go with it. Nicknamed the Butcher of Plainfield, or the Plainfield Ghoul, Ed Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin on August 27, 1906, to George and Augusta Gein. George was a timid alcoholic, however Augusta had a very domineering presence in both Ed and his older brother Henry's lives. Augusta was fanatically religious and taught the boys that things like sex and women were evils that were to be avoided.
When Ed was 9, the family moved to a farm outside of Plainfield, Wisconsin. During his time in school, Ed rarely left the farm, only ever going to school. In 1940, George died, putting the responsibility on Ed and Henry to support the family. In 1944, Henry died while the pair were burning brush and the fire got out of hand, while Augusta died in 1945, leaving Ed alone. This is where Ed's grip on sanity began to slip. During her life, Ed had been extremely close with his mother, beyond just a standard mother-son relationship, and upon her death, he made her room a shrine to her, making sure it remained spotless while completely disregarding the state of the rest of the house. However, he continued working as a handyman and, quite hauntingly if I'm being honest, a babysitter. During this time, people in the town of Plainfield were going missing, most importantly, Mary Hogan, a 54-year-old bartender. On November 16th of 1957, Bernice Warden went missing from the hardware store she worked at, and when the police arrived at the store, a trail of blood leading out to the back was found. Immediately suspicious of the reclusive Geen, they went to his house to find Warden's body hanging from the ceiling, gutted and headless, as well as various other body parts in use, such as skulls being used as soup bowls and a belt made of nipples. When Geen was interviewed, he admitted to killing Warden, as well as the aforementioned Hogan, and robbing various graves of those who reminded him of his mother, practicing necrophilia, and making the skin suits he is most infamous for. His defense argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, and when he was finally deemed fit to stand trial in 1968, this was successful, getting him committed to the Central State Hospital for the rest of his life, which ended on July 27th of 1984 due to lung cancer and respiratory illness. Being as infamous a serial killer as he is, he's certain to leave a legacy. However, Geen is interesting because of how often he is revealed to be the basis for characters in popular culture. Many know that Norman Bates from Psycho is based on Geen, however he has also been referenced in the creation of other famous movie killers, such as Leatherface and Buffalo Bill, both cannibals, which I'm pretty sure is the reason he's on here. Kuru, also known as the laughing disease due to the fact that many who contract it die laughing, is an extinct prion disease from the Foray people of New Guinea. This disease was contracted through ritual practices of cannibalism that involved eating a human brain, which would transmit the prion. This consumption of past relatives was intended to fuse their body to those who were still living, freeing their souls in the afterlife. This was a very planned ritual, with men specifically eating muscles, while women and children ate the cerebrum, increasing their chances of contracting Kuru. Symptoms of the disease include migraines, muscle jerks, pain in arms and legs, deteriorating coordination, and drastic changes in mood near the end, such as euphoria or depression, which is where the laughing comes from. Death usually happens about a year from the beginning of the symptoms. Luckily, because the practice stopped in 1960, the disease has stopped spreading. However, due to an incubation period that lasts as long as 50 years, many people have more recently begun experiencing symptoms. To be quite honest, I really wasn't able to find much information about Richard Apaya due to it being a case outside of the United States, and I don't want to simply cover something like this to talk about how gross what he did was. A quick overview is that he killed and ate 2 young boys, aged 12 and 15, and has been in prison ever since, with the trial only beginning about a year before writing this. The Franklin Lost Expedition refers to the expedition of the HMS Terror and HMS Erebus, headed by Sir John Franklin, sent from England searching for the Northwest Passage, a theoretical sea route between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans that would have made transportation of goods much easier. Prior to his final expedition, Franklin made 2 others searching for the passage without having any success. 7 weeks prior to departing, Franklin finalized a contract with Stephen Goldner, the owner of a canning company, to make 8,000 tins of food for the expedition. Unfortunately, such a short deadline resulted in the canning being low quality, with many of the tins being sealed by lead soldering. On May 19th of 1845, they set sail, traveling to Greenland with the HMS Rattler and the Barretto Jr., stopping in Disco Bay, where 5 men were discharged, and they left the Rattler and Barretto Jr. Following this, the pair of ships sailed to Nunavut, Canada, and the last time the crew was seen alive was in July of 1845 by the crews of a pair of whaling ships. The cold up here can't be understated, reaching temperatures as low as -31 degrees Fahrenheit by day and -54 by night. It was so cold that when they were using metal instruments, they had to hold their breath because the condensation could turn to ice, and even pulling off a ski mask could peel skin off with it. Luckily, the boats had a heating system that, though rudimentary compared to modern technology, did provide some respite from the conditions outside. The expedition sailed up the Wellington Channel and spent the winter on Beechey Island, as confirmed by some remains found in 1850, before sailing south to Peel Sound. Upon reaching here, they were cut off by ice off the north of King William Island. In spring of 1847, a party traveled to Point Victory to deposit a written record of the expedition's progress. The crew is thought to have reached Cape Herschel, however it isn't known how far they truly got. In June of 1847, Sir John Franklin died, to which the mantle of captain was taken up by Francis Crozier, who had commanded the HMS Terror up to that point. Slightly less than a year later, on April 22nd of 1848, Crozier ordered that the expedition be abandoned, and the 105 men still alive headed south for the Great Fish River, though most would end up dying on this trek. Around this time, the first of over 30 search parties were sent, the British government even offering 20,000 British pounds for information on the expedition. Many of the crews would ask the Inuit people local to the area for information regarding the whereabouts of the crew, as some were found to be in possession of items from the ships. However, on March 31st of 1854, Britain declared the crews deceased. Unsatisfied with this answer, Lady Franklin, John Franklin's wife, paid for a private search that found the aforementioned Point Victory note that gave them information on the crew's progress and confirming the death of John Franklin. Many of the bones found during the initial searches and since have confirmed that the killers were primarily exposure, starvation, scurvy, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. However, another interesting thing found is that lead poisoning from the lead soldering also possibly led to loss of life. Finally, mutilation on the bones confirmed that at least some of the crew had resorted to cannibalism. Many discoveries of this expedition have been found since the 129 men tragically lost their lives, most interesting being that in 2014 and 2016, the Terror and Erebus have been found. Once one of the most feared people in Indonesia, Sumanto, nicknamed the Hannibal Lecter of Indonesia and the basis for the movie Cannibal Sumanto, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for stealing and eating the body of Mbak Raina. I'm sorry, I really hope that's how I pronounce it. He was born on March 3rd of 1972 and lived a mostly normal childhood, the only notable events during this time being that he was forced to repeat 6th grade and dropped out of middle school, which in Indonesia is the grades of 7th through 9th, during his 3rd year. Little else of interest happened to him during this time, however it is known that he worked on a sugarcane plantation for a time, exactly when is uncertain, where he first committed cannibalism after killing 2 men in self-defense. He also said he cut off, dried, and kept one of the men's genitalia as an amulet. In interviews, he revealed that he had intended to eat 7 bodies, which would give him supernatural powers and a, quote, peaceful soul. On January 15th of 2003, Sumanto was arrested for stealing and eating the aforementioned body of a recently deceased 80-year-old woman, Mbak Raina. For this crime, he was sentenced to 5 years for theft, since at that point cannibalism hadn't been covered as a crime, though that was changed by Article 271 into the Indonesian Criminal Code shortly after. Despite this, he appealed it and a prior conviction of 6 years, arguing that because the body was buried, it was to be considered human waste and therefore not theft. This was unsuccessful, and he stayed in jail until his release on October 24th of 2006, receiving a multitude of remissions. Having nowhere else to go, he returned to his hometown, however was promptly ostracized and placed in a rehabilitation center in Bangkanal, Karanganyar, Purbalingga. I'm sorry. Interestingly, since he has been placed in a rehabilitation center, he has become a social media influencer and garnered a significant following online, namely an Instagram account with over 21,000 followers. This was spurred on in 2024 when he was invited to be a brand ambassador for Ban Yumas. The positive reception to his presence at the event allowed him to grow his social media to the number of about 21,000 followers, where he posts things like motivational quotes and memes under the name Sumanto Garang Reborn. This has really changed his public perception, shifting it from that of a crazed cannibal to a more human image. Possibly the most disgusting person to ever live, Albert Fish is one of the most prolific serial killers of the 1920s and 30s, suspected of murdering over 100 children, though was only ever convicted of one murder and confirmed to have committed 3. He was born Hamilton Fish on May 19th of 1870 to Randall and Ellen Fish and a family with a long history of mental illness, as many of his relatives were known to suffer from things like hallucinations. At the time of his birth, his father was 75 years old and died when Hamilton was 5. His mother, unable to take care of him, sent him to St. John's Orphanage in D.C., where his sadomasochism began, caused by abuse suffered to all the boys at the orphanage. When Fish was 10, he was removed from the orphanage and returned to living with his mother, though shortly after, one of his numerous fetishes was introduced to him by a friend who taught him about coprophagia and urophagia. If you know what that is, I'm really sorry, and if you don't know, please don't look it up. He had very little education as a child, and was instead forced to work with his hands. At 15, he dropped out of school to work at a grocery store, and was possibly a homosexual prostitute at this time, where he picked up the habit of molesting young boys. Rather than finish his education, he apprenticed to a painter/decorator. Around this time, his already gross fantasies became even more extreme, moving to things like torture, murder, and cannibalism. At age 28, he married an 18-year-old woman named Anna Marie Hoffman. She left him almost 20 years later in 1917, however they never officially divorced. Fish married another 3 women in short succession after this, resulting in him legally being married to more than one woman. He fathered 6 children with Anna, who always said that they had no idea of his proclivities. However, he did get them to play masochistic games with him, including one which they beat him with a nail-studded paddle until he bled. His masochism extended even further than tricking his children into hitting him, as he often stuck needles into his groin area, something confirmed when an X-ray revealed 27 pieces of needles around his pelvis, and he often burned himself with matches. Throughout his life, he worked across the country as a painter, and at most, if not all of the cities he worked in, would molest, torture, and/or kill a child. All his victims were from minorities, namely African American or financially disadvantaged individuals. Unfortunately, the true number of children he murdered will never truly be known. Detective William King, the chief investigator on Fish's case, believes him to have killed 4, while psychiatrist Frederick Worthen suspects 5, and the police department believes between 8 and 15. However, the sad reality is that he is quite likely guilty of over 100 murders. The murder that eventually got him arrested, however, is that of Grace Budd. In 1928, Fish, using the name of Frank Howard, responded to an ad from Edward Budd, an 18-year-old looking for work. Fish said he was in need of a couple of farmhands and was willing to pay $15 a week, which, during the Great Depression, was an enormous amount of money. On June the 4th, Fish arrived at the Budd house bearing gifts to all the children, before offering to take the 10-year-old daughter, Grace Budd, to a birthday party at his sister's house. Not wanting to offend the grandfatherly Mr. Howard, the Budds accepted. Of course, this party did not exist, and he instead brought Budd to his Wisteria cottage in Westchester County of New York. The family did everything in their power to find Grace, however no leads came for years until Fish engaged in another one of his sick pleasures and sent a letter to the Budd house detailing how he had murdered and cannibalized Grace Budd. The police were able to find the identity of the man who had sent the letter, tracing it back to 66-year-old Albert Fish, who found on him some of his disgusting writings, including some about practicing cannibalism. His defense tried to argue not guilty by reason of insanity, which kind of worked. Fish was convicted of the murder of Grace Budd, and was deemed insane, however should still be put to death. Before he was put to death, he admitted to the murders of 2 more boys, Billy Gaffney, age 4, and Francis McDonnell, age 8. Then, finally, Fish was electrocuted on January 16th of 1936 in the Sing Sing prison in New York.
And with that, we are done with the first tier of the Cannibalism Iceberg. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hoped you enjoyed the video. This one was really fun to research, and I'm excited to get the other 9 parts out to you all. I think I'll be doing 1 tier every other video, but that might change with school and everything else I've got going on. Real quick though, thank you all so much for all the support you showed my last video. It really was amazing to see it get any views, so like over 100 was awesome. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.